This presentation was supported by contract number HHSS 2702017-00001C from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, co-funded by Children's Bureau, CB, and the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, ACYF. The views, opinions, and content of this presentation are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of SAMHSA, ACYF, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. This video is intended to be a training opportunity. The simulated case staffing is hypothetical of a child welfare scenario. For training purposes, the content and conversations in this animated video highlight opportunities for improved practice and the need for person-first language. Child welfare systems are complex and vary widely by state. These training resources are not a final agency action and do not legally bind persons or entities outside of the federal government. Each state incorporates the requirements of federal legislation into its state child welfare laws. These state laws specify when and how child welfare and dependency courts will be involved in the lives of families. When a child is under court supervision, the dependency court is responsible for monitoring that child's safety and ensuring that he or she has permanency in the caregiving relationship following the timeline specified in the Adoption and Safe Families Act, ASFA.
Child welfare mock case staffing, child welfare court case, characters on screen, child attorney, child welfare worker, parent attorney, and parent. Judge speaking.
Welcome and please be seated. We are here to discuss the progress and the need for continued out-of-home placement on the dependency case involving the Ballinger children. I have reviewed the progress report filed by the department. Ms. Rodriguez, you noted in your report to the court that the children remain in their placement with the maternal grandmother.
Ms. Rodriguez, child welfare worker.
Yes, Your Honor. The children are succeeding in their placement with Mrs. Ballinger's mother. Mrs. Ballinger is currently participating in several services: parent-child interaction therapy, individual counseling, supervised visitation, and outpatient medication-assisted treatment.
I would like to thank Mrs. Ballinger for being here today and ask her if she would like to address the court.
Parent, Mrs. Ballinger.
No.
Parent attorney.
Your Honor, my client is not comfortable and has asked me to answer any questions.
I look forward to hearing about her progress, Ms. Rodriguez. Please continue.
Sure. This family has a history of involvement with the department and, as reflected in the progress report, a history of chronic neglect. In addition, the children's father was in foster care as a youth. The case plan goal remains reunification, and we are working with the parents to improve their parenting capacity and protective factors within the family to address risks identified during our assessment. One issue I'd like to raise is that Mrs. Ballinger is receiving methadone through an outpatient substance use treatment program. Mrs. Ballinger continues to use methadone. I want to point out that the department has asked her to stop taking methadone so she can advance to unsupervised visitation with her children. I do want to add that during my monthly home visits with Mrs. Ballinger, she always denies using illegal drugs. She does, however, admit to taking methadone currently. Mrs. Ballinger is currently using methadone, and that is why I haven't recommended unsupervised visits with her and the kids yet.
Wait a moment. Does my client understand the requirements before supervised visits can happen and before her children will be placed back with her? Have you explained this to her?
Yes, I believe she does understand. However, she isn't pleased that the children are not residing with her currently, and she would like unsupervised visits with her children.
Ms. Rodriguez, please continue with any additional information about the children's father, Mr. Ballinger, and then we can continue this discussion regarding visitation for Mrs. Ballinger.
Yes, as I mentioned, Mr. Quinn Ballinger is the father in this case. He is currently receiving inpatient substance use disorder treatment through his probation case. His probation officer said that he is doing well and is ready to transition to an outpatient substance use disorder treatment program.
Child attorney.
Could Mr. Ballinger be considered for reunification with the children after he completes his inpatient program? Maybe Mrs. Ballinger's mother, who is caring for the children right now, can provide support to Mr. Ballinger if the children live with him?
I want my kids to stay with my mom until I finish my case plan, and then they can come back home with me.
The goal in this case is reunification with the parent. The department can explore placement options with both parents concurrently. The current plan is for the department to place the children with Mrs. Ballinger.
Thank you.
Please proceed with providing information about Mrs. Ballinger's case.
As I stated previously, Mrs. Ballinger receives family support services, participates in therapy with her children, parenting classes, medication assisted treatment, and other treatment services to help address her substance use disorder. The most recent report of suspected child abuse and neglect, about 6 months ago now, states that Mrs. Ballinger started using methadone instead of heroin. Mrs. Ballinger is not currently engaged in illegal drugs, but she did test positive for methadone in her most recent toxicology screening. I don't think that Mrs. Ballinger should have unsupervised visitation with her children until she has a negative drug screen result.
I disagree with the agency's recommendation to deny my client unsupervised visitation with her children. Mrs. Ballinger has participated in all of her urine screenings, and they were negative for illegal drugs. I object to the child welfare worker's assertion that Mrs. Ballinger was somehow engaged in the illegal use of drugs because of a positive urine screen result for methadone. Her screens should show the presence of methadone because that's what she is prescribed to treat her opioid use disorder. Is the agency suggesting that the children are not safe with her because Mrs. Ballinger is prescribed methadone and has complied with the recommendations of her physician and treatment provider? I believe that if the decision for supervised visits is based on my client's history of addiction and her current legal use of methadone, that decision violates her federal civil rights.
Thank you, counsel. You raise an interesting point about potential civil rights concerns. I recently attended a conference where professionals from the federal government discussed civil rights protections for people like Mrs. Ballinger who are in recovery from an opioid use disorder. I was particularly struck by the idea that federal civil rights laws apply to child welfare in court activities. Were you aware of that? I don't know yet if Mrs. Ballinger's rights were violated, but we can explore this further after I hear all arguments on the issue regarding supervised visitation or unsupervised visitation. I'll ask my clerk to bring copies of the handouts from the Civil Rights Workshop. In the meantime, I want to hear from the children's attorney. Counsel, what are your thoughts?
We heard from the child welfare worker that Mrs. Ballinger is participating in the services included in the case plan, and she does attend an outpatient substance use treatment program where she receives methadone. We also heard that while her urine screens are positive for methadone, the screening did not show the presence of illegal drugs. Ms. Rodriguez seems especially concerned that Mrs. Ballinger did not follow the agency's recommendation to discontinue the use of methadone. I'm not sure why she would, especially since methadone is safe to use while under a doctor's care. I read in a recent journal of substance abuse treatment that MAT can help lessen the risk of relapse. I think it would be helpful for the court to provide additional information about MAT programs so we can better understand Mrs. Ballinger's use of methadone and assess if her civil rights were violated. This would be a good training opportunity for all of us.
The judge is reading from the Office for Civil Rights, OCRS PowerPoint presentation, Exploring Civil Rights Protections for Individuals in Recovery from an Opioid Addiction.
Here it is, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act are federal laws that protect some people in recovery from an opioid use disorder from discrimination on the basis of disability. Hold on, I'm looking for the section that talks about MAT. Yes, because MAT medications are prescribed and are taken under the supervision of a licensed healthcare professional, the receipt of MAT is not the illegal use of drugs. Any thoughts?
Well, Ms. Rodriguez said that Mrs. Ballinger is taking methadone under the supervision of a doctor.
Yes, that is true. I am attending a MAT program that prescribes me methadone.
And her urine screen results show that she's not engaging in the illegal use of drugs. Her screens only showed the presence of methadone. So, she is protected, right?
But Mrs. Ballinger was not in compliance with her case plan because she continued to use methadone against the recommendations of the agency. Isn't Child Protective Services allowed to recommend that a parent stops taking prescription medication, especially if the medication will negatively impact how it makes you feel? Doesn't her failure to stop taking methadone show that she is addicted to the drug?
Your Honor, this is outrageous. Would the agency recommend a parent stop taking medication for a condition such as diabetes?
CPS equals Child Protective Services.
CPS provided treatment for her substance use disorder, and now CPS is using this program against her, and the consequence is taking away her children?
I am deeply troubled by the agency's demand that Mrs. Ballinger stop taking methadone. The civil rights issues raised during this discussion are complicated and require a more thorough inquiry into the agency's recommendation. Next week, all parties, including the department's supervisor, should be prepared for the agency's recommendations to increase Mrs. Ballinger's visits to unsupervised. I also want an updated report from both parents' treatment programs. Regarding the civil rights issues raised here today, please review the training materials and resources that I shared. I think there may be some additional information in the Technical Assistance for State and Local Child Welfare Agencies and Courts document that may inform the agency's position on whether the agency complies with federal disability rights laws. Thank you, everyone.